Have you ever wondered what lurks in the shadows of the woods, those places we run to for escape, only to find something waiting for us instead? Hey there, I'm Waller, and welcome to No Sleep Nightmares Reddit. Tonight, I've got 3 spine-chilling tales that'll make you think twice before pitching a tent. We're diving into the Hudson Valley's haunted trails, the Redwoods that whisper in the dark, and a lone camper's nightmare in Pisgah, each one creepier than the last. Stick around, because the 4th twist in these stories is something so ordinary, so close to home, it'll crawl under your skin and stay there. Before we get lost in the terror, do me a solid, hit that like button, share this with your fellow night owls, and smash that subscribe button to help me reach 1,000 subs. The more you support No Sleep Nightmares Reddit, the more twisted tales I can bring straight to your sleepless nights. Ready to step into the dark? Let's go. The air in Herman State Park was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, a perfume so heavy it clung to the inside of my nostrils like a second skin. It was the summer I turned 14, back when the world still felt big and wild and conquerable, before I learned that some things in the dark don't care how brave you think you are. My family had dragged me and my best friend Thomas up from our cushy little cul-de-sac in New Jersey to this sprawling wilderness in New York's Hudson Valley. A few hours drive sure, but it might as well have been another planet. The suburbs were all manicured lawns and porch lights that never went out. Here, the trees stretched up like giants, their gnarled branches clawing at a sky that seemed to press down on us with every passing hour. Thomas and I were buzzing with that dumb, reckless energy only kids can muster. We'd spent weeks plotting this trip, dreaming of hiking trails that twisted like veins through the forest, of campfire stories that'd make our spines tingle, of proving we were tougher than the adults thought. My parents were the outdoorsy type, always yammering about nature's beauty and fresh air, but to us, it was a playground, a vast, untamed labyrinth of oaks and maples, their leaves so dense they swallowed the sunlight whole, leaving only slivers to dance on the forest floor. The campground near Lake Tiara was alive that first day, families hauling coolers, kids shrieking as they splashed in the water, the crackle of firewood popping under the late afternoon sun. We set up our tents, 2 flimsy nylon castles staked into the dirt, and spent the day swimming until our fingers pruned and our stomachs growled for hot dogs and marshmallows. That first night, the stars punched holes in the black velvet sky, and Thomas and I huddled by the fire, our faces glowing orange in the flickering light. We traded ghost stories like they were currency, each one creepier, gorier, more absurd than the last. I told one about a hitchhiker with no face who whispered your name until you went mad. He countered with a tale of a deer that wasn't a deer, its antlers dripping with something too red to be sap. We laughed, we shivered, we scared ourselves stupid, but it was all a game, the kind of fear you can shake off with a marshmallow and a dumb joke. "What's scarier than a ghost?" Thomas asked, grinning like an idiot. "Your mum when she finds out you ate all the s'mores?" Harmless, safe, that's what it was supposed to be. The next day passed in a blur of family hikes along the Pine Meadow Trail, the kind where my dad kept stopping to point out birds I didn't care about, and my mum snapped photos like we were posing for a magazine. By evening, Thomas and I were itching for something more. We called it the walk, our little rebellion against the grown-ups' watchful eyes. The night was clear, the air cool and crisp, and our flashlights cut through the darkness like twin swords. We veered off the main path, giggling about the dumb stories we'd told, daring each other to go deeper into the woods. The forest swallowed us whole. Crickets chirped a relentless chorus, their song buzzing in my ears like static. An owl hooted somewhere far off, its call echoing through the trees like a warning we were too stupid to heed. The ground crunched under our sneakers, leaves, twigs, the occasional pine cone that rolled away with a hollow clatter. It was alive out there, but it didn't feel threatening. Not yet. Then we heard it. A faint rustling, sharp and sudden, like something bigger than a squirrel darting through the underbrush. We froze, flashlights sweeping the shadows. Nothing but tree trunks and bushes, their shapes twisting into gnarled faces if you stared too long. "Probably just a deer," I said, my voice a little too loud, like I was trying to convince myself. Thomas nodded, but his grin faltered. We kept walking, deeper into the maze of trails, the air growing colder, heavier, like it was pressing down on our shoulders. The rustling came again, closer this time, followed by a low murmur, a sound that didn't belong. Not wind, not animals, not the hum of distant campers. It was human. Words, maybe, but too soft to catch, slithering through the trees like smoke. My pulse kicked up a notch, thudding in my ears. Thomas shot me a look, half nervous, half excited. "Another camper," he whispered, but his voice cracked on the last syllable. We swung our flashlights ahead, beams slicing through the dark, and that's when we saw her. She was on all fours, crawling across the path like some broken marionette. Her dark clothes hung off her frame, tattered and stained, blending into the shadows. Her hair was a wild tangle, matted with leaves and dirt, obscuring her face. She muttered to herself, a stream of nonsense that buzzed like flies in my skull. My breath caught, a sharp little gasp I couldn't stifle. Thomas's flashlight trembled in his hand, the beam jittering across her form. "Hey!" I called, my voice thin and shaky. "You okay?" Stupid question, right? Like anyone crawling through the woods at night muttering gibberish is just peachy. She froze, then turned her head toward us, slow and deliberate, like a predator sizing up prey. The light caught her eyes, wild, bloodshot, glinting like wet glass. My stomach dropped. She lurched to her feet, swaying like she might topple any second, and kept muttering, something about campsite and lost, but the words slurred together, thick and wet, like her tongue was too heavy for her mouth. Drunk, I thought, or dehydrated, or both. That's what my brain latched onto, because the alternative, something worse, was too big to fit in my 14-year-old head. Thomas and I exchanged a look. "We should help," he said. But he didn't sound sure, neither was I. Still we stepped closer, each taking an arm. Her skin was clammy cold as the lake water we'd swum in, and she smelled like sour sweat and something metallic I couldn't place. We guided her back toward the main trail, her weight dragging between us, her muttering a constant drone in my ears. The forest pressed in tighter, the trees looming like silent witnesses. Her campsite wasn't far, a mess of scattered gear, a half-collapsed tent, no sign of anyone else. She mumbled about friends, but it was a jumbled mess, and those red-rimmed eyes didn't look like they'd seen a friend in a long time. We gave her water, helped her lie down, and bolted back to our own site, hearts hammering like we'd outrun a bear. The next morning, we saw her again. She was by the lake, sitting at a picnic table, staring at the water like it held all the answers she'd lost. Her eyes were hollow, her face pale as bone, and when we waved, she barely twitched, like we were ghosts to her. My parents noticed us acting weird, asked what was up, but we just shrugged and said we'd seen a drunk camper. They bought it, or pretended to, and I tried to shove the unease down deep, where it couldn't claw its way back up. She was just some lost soul, right? Nothing to lose sleep over, famous last words. That evening, my dad drove into Slosberg for supplies, and Thomas and I, idiots that we were, decided to take another walk. The forest was calmer now, the crickets softer, the air still. We told ourselves we'd imagined the worst, that she was just a sad drunk who'd wandered too far. Dark humor crept in to steady our nerves. "Maybe she's the park's unofficial greeter," Thomas said, smirking. "Welcome to Herman State, kid. Enjoy the crazy." I laughed, but it sounded hollow, bouncing off the trees like a bad echo. We didn't get far before the sound started again, muffled, distant, but unmistakable. Voices, or one voice, low and urgent, threading through the underbrush. We killed our flashlights, ears straining. There she was, standing by a tree, her silhouette sharp against the dim moonlight. She was talking, gesturing wildly, but no one was there. No phone, no headset, just her, and the empty air. My skin prickled. Thomas grabbed my sleeve, his fingers digging in. Her head snapped toward us, eyes wide and white, like she'd caught us spying on a secret we weren't meant to know. For a second, I thought she'd lunge, but she just froze, her mouth working silently, like a fish drowning in air. "Back off," Thomas hissed, and I didn't argue. We turned and hauled ass back to camp, branches snapping underfoot, our breaths loud and ragged. The forest felt alive now, too alive, every rustle a footstep, every shadow a threat. We crashed into our tents panting and tried to sleep, but midnight brought new terror. Something rummaged outside, soft thumps, the crinkle of leaves, a whisper of movement. My parents snored on, oblivious, but I was wide awake, heart slamming against my ribs. "Raccoon," I told myself. "Deer, anything but her." I peeked out, flashlight trembling, and saw nothing, but the air was wrong, thick with a weight I couldn't name. By dawn, Thomas and I were done. We packed in a frenzy, barely speaking, and when I told my parents we wanted out, they didn't push. Maybe they saw the panic in our eyes, the kind you can't fake. As we loaded the car, I spotted her one last time, standing by the ranger station, her posture limp, her face a mask of exhaustion. I wanted to ask if she was okay, to demand answers, but my voice died in my throat. We peeled out, tires crunching gravel, and she vanished behind a bend in the road. Gone, but not gone enough. The drive home was silent, the Hudson Valley shrinking in the rearview mirror. Thomas stared out the window, his usual chatter buried under something heavy. I kept replaying it, her crawling, her muttering, those hollow eyes. Was she lost, drunk, or was she something else, something the woods had claimed and spat back out? I didn't know. I still don't. But here's the kicker, folks. Real life doesn't tie up loose ends like a campfire tale. There's no punchline, no big reveal. Just a memory that festers, a face that haunts, and a question that gnaws at me even now. What the hell was she looking for out there in the dark? And why do I feel like she's still looking? That's the thing about the woods, isn't it? You think you're the one exploring, but sometimes it's the forest that finds you. That eerie encounter in Herman State Park left a mark, one that lingers like a shadow you can't shake. But if you thought the Hudson Valley held secrets, wait until you hear what's next. Up in Northern California, a pair of newlyweds thought they'd found paradise among the redwoods until the trees started whispering back. I'm Waller, and this is No Sleep Nightmares Reddit. If you're hooked already, smash that subscribe button and drop a comment. Tell me, what would you do if the dark started talking? Let's dive deeper. The road to Redwood National and State Parks stretched out before us like a ribbon, unspooling into oblivion, flanked by trees so tall they seemed to scrape the underside of the sky. It was last spring, right after my wife and I tied the knot, when the world still smelled like wedding cake and promise. We were Bay Area kids, used to concrete jungles and traffic hums, so the idea of a honeymoon camping trip 5 hours north felt like a grand escape, a chance to trade city lights for starlight and honking horns for the rustle of leaves. A storm had ripped through the region the day before, leaving behind a trail of snapped branches and flooded creeks, but we figured the worst was over. The forecast promised clear skies, and our optimism was as fresh as the rings on our fingers. We packed our shiny new tent, a cooler stuffed with food, and a playlist of cheesy love songs into the car, and off we went, laughing like newlyweds do when the future's still a blank page. The drive up US 101 was a postcard come to life once the clouds parted, golden sunlight spilling over rolling hills, the ocean glinting like a sheet of shattered glass on our left. We stopped in Eureka for supplies, extra water, a bundle of firewood, a bag of marshmallows because my wife, Ellie, insisted no camping trip was complete without s'mores. She grinned at me from the passenger seat, her hair catching the breeze through the open window, and I thought, this is it. This is what forever looks like. By the time we reached the park's entrance, the afternoon was fading into a soft, amber glow. A lone ranger shuffled out of a wooden booth, his face weathered like the bark of the trees around us. "Not many campers this weekend," he said, handing us our permit. "You two might have the place to yourselves." Ellie squeezed my hand, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Alone in the wild with my new wife? Sounded like paradise. The road narrowed as we drove deeper into the forest, pavement giving way to gravel that crunched under our tires like brittle bones. The redwoods loomed on either side, towering, ancient sentinels with trunks wider than our car, their branches weaving a canopy that swallowed the sky. It felt like we were being devoured, sucked into the belly of something vast and unblinking. Our campsite was a small clearing, just a patch of dirt circled by giants, with a fire ring and a picnic table weathered by years of rain and wind. No other cars, no distant laughter, no signs of life. Just us and the trees. Ellie clapped her hands, calling it romantic, and I nodded, though the silence pressed against my ears like a physical thing. Forests are supposed to hum, birds chirping, leaves rustling, critters skittering. Here it was mute, as if the storm had scared the life out of the place and left only echoes behind. We set up camp quick, tent staked, cooler unpacked, sleeping bags rolled out. The sun was still up, so we wandered down the trail we'd driven in on, hoping to find a lookout or something worth a photo. The redwoods stretched endlessly, their bark rough and red as dried blood, their shadows pooling on the ground like ink. Every few steps we'd spot storm debris, branches splintered like matchsticks, puddles of muddy water glinting in the fading light. About half a mile in, we stumbled on something odd. A cluster of cabins, abandoned and rotting. Grey paint peeled off their walls like flaking skin, windows gaped black and broken, doors sagged on rusted hinges, old ranger stations maybe, or a campground long since forgotten. They squatted there, silent and wrong, like teeth in a skull that had been picked clean. Ellie shivered, tugging my arm. "Creepy," she muttered, and we turned back, the cabin's empty eyes watching us go. Back at camp, we wrestled with a fire. The ranger's firewood was dry, but everything else was damp, twigs soggy, leaves slick with leftover rain. I fumbled with kindling, cursing under my breath, while Ellie laughed and called me Mr. Wilderness. Eventually, we got a weak flame going with a store-bought fire log, its synthetic crackle, a poor substitute for the real thing. We roasted hot dogs, their skins blistering over the heat, and toasted marshmallows until they oozed golden and black. The firelight danced on Ellie's face, painting her in warm tones, and for a moment, the isolation felt cozy, intimate. But when the sun sank behind the redwoods, the darkness hit like a guillotine. No moon, no stars, just a black so thick it seemed to seep into my lungs with every breath. Ellie leaned against me on the picnic table, her voice soft. "I've never seen a sky this dark." I nodded, but the quiet gnawed at me. No crickets, no owls, just the faint hiss of our dying fire. An hour passed, the cold creeping in, and Ellie's nerves started to fray. "Can we call it a night?" she asked, her fingers tight around mine. I agreed. Something about the stillness was starting to itch under my skin too. We doused the fire, triple-checking it was out, and crawled into the tent. Zipped into our sleeping bags, we whispered about the wedding, the drive, the little house we'd buy someday. Her voice was a lifeline, soft and familiar, pulling me back from the edge of unease. Maybe half an hour later, she went stiff beside me, her breath hitching. "Shh," she hissed, pressing a finger to my lips. I froze, ears straining. At first, nothing, just the thud of my own pulse. Then it came, footsteps, deliberate and wet, crunching through the leaves outside. My mind spun. Animals, I told myself. Deer, raccoons, something normal. But then the murmurs started, low, guttural, threading through the night like a needle through fabric. Not one voice, but several, overlapping in a whispery hum I couldn't decode. Ellie's eyes locked on mine, wide and glassy, silently begging for an explanation I didn't have. The footsteps circled the tent, slow and methodical, snapping twigs with a sound like breaking fingers. The air grew heavy, thick with a sour, earthy stench that crept through the nylon walls. My heart slammed against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat I couldn't quiet. The murmurs sharpened, still too soft to catch, but close, too close. The tent fabric shifted, a faint rustle as something brushed against it, and Ellie's nails dug into my hand, sharp enough to draw blood. I wanted to shout, to demand who was out there, but my throat locked up, dry as ash. The footsteps paused, the whispers cutting off like a switch flipped, and for a moment the silence was worse, pregnant, suffocating, like the forest was holding its breath. Then, just as suddenly it was gone. No crunch, no murmur, nothing. We lay there, rigid, waiting for it to start again, counting seconds that stretched into hours. Ellie's breathing was shallow, her grip unrelenting, and I could feel the sweat slicking my palms despite the chill. Finally, I couldn't take it. "We're leaving," I whispered, my voice a cracked shell of itself. She nodded, tears glinting in the dark. I unzipped the tent, slow and quiet, and peeked out. The clearing was still, the redwoods standing like mute giants, their branches clawing at a sky that offered no light. Nothing moved. I gestured for Ellie to follow, and we bolted for the car, bare feet slapping the cold dirt. I locked us in, keys shaking in my hand, and told her to stay put. "I'll grab the gear," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Stepping out, the air hit me, icy, damp, laced with that same sour rot. The hairs on my neck stood up, prickling like needles. I snatched the cooler, tossing it in the back, but when I turned for the tent, a twig snapped, sharp, close, deliberate. My blood turned to ice. I ripped the tent stakes out, fabric tangling in my arms, and hurled it into the trunk, every nerve screaming to run. Back in the driver's seat, I gunned the engine, reversing out of the sight with a lurch that rattled my teeth. The gravel path twisted ahead, and at an unmarked fork, I froze, lost, disoriented, the forest a labyrinth closing in. Ellie fumbled with the map, her voice trembling. "Where's the damn exit?" Panic clawed up my throat until I spotted a faded arrow sign, half hidden by ferns. I swung the wheel, tires skidding, and floored it, the redwoods blurring into a tunnel of shadow. As we neared the main gate, something flickered in my peripheral, a single glowing light, bobbing amidst the trees like a will-o'-wisp. Headlamp? Flashlight? I didn't care. We didn't stop. At least in the concrete jungle, you can see what's coming. Out there, in the dark, something saw us first, and I don't think it's done looking.